Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not quite sure how to follow my friend from Sackville, Preston Chesacook. As he knows, I will try and do so with facts as opposed to volume, Mr. Speaker. He knows that my family that live in Fall River in his riding have a great deal of respect for him, as I do, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the speech he was given tonight with respect to NAFTA doesn't reflect really what happened in the negotiations and the deal, Mr. Speaker. And as a Nova Scotian MP, he would know that he ended his remarks. The future of economic development right now in Nova Scotia, the success being had is attributable to two things. First, the amazing potential and institutions and entrepreneurs of Atlantic Canada and of Nova Scotia in particular. But second has been the strategic focus on trade, on infrastructure that took place during the Harper government, Mr. Speaker. And specifically, Atlantic Canada has never seen a larger investment than the awarding of the shipbuilding contract to the Halifax shipyards, the largest in the history of Atlantic Canada, attributable to the Conservatives. And I'm very proud of that, having served on board one of the frigates bought previously by the last majority Conservative governments of Mulroney. It's the Conservative governments, when they are in, Mr. Speaker, have to modernize and update the Canadian Armed Forces every generation. We see this government buying 40-year-old used aircraft from Australia, Mr. Speaker, being parodied on the world stage. But the investment at the Halifax shipyard is impressive. In fact, I'll be going to see it again this summer, Mr. Speaker. What is interesting as well for the Halifax Regional Municipality, and an area that he should know well, is in that his riding abuts the Halifax Airport, Mr. Speaker, is Peter MacKay made it a priority for the runways at the Robert Stanfield Airport, Mr. Speaker, to be extended. Why is that? Because the longer runways allowed for more cargo flights to be able to take Atlantic Canadian exports around the world, Mr. Speaker. Exports like lobster to South Korea. So as Parliamentary Secretary in the Harper government, I was proud to visit the cargo terminal at Stanfield International in Halifax to see one of the first few months' worth of flights taking Nova Scotia lobster fished from Cape Breton right down through to the South Shore and to Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker, to new markets in Asia to secure a better price for the products. In fact, the CETA trade deal was particularly beneficial to a number of key industries in Atlantic Canada, particularly seafood side, as was the bilateral trade deal with South Korea that I was involved in, Mr. Speaker. If you do the rundown, you go up to Cape Breton, the tar ponds that used to be talked about for generations when I was in law school at Dalhousie or serving at Shearwater, were finally cleaned up under the Conservatives. Now, the trouble is, by the time we get these projects done, Mr. Speaker, we've kind of done the heavy lifting and we don't get to cut some of the ribbons that the new people do. But I would like that member to spend a few moments researching that. I, at the moment, Mr. Speaker, can't point to one major investment by this government. In fact, when their minister in charge of the Atlantic Opportunities Agency is based out of Mississauga, Mr. Speaker, and when they tried to break with 80-year tradition to block an Atlantic Canadian jurist from the Supreme Court of Canada, defying constitutional precedent, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest Atlantic Canadians have seen there is zero priority for their needs with this government. Zero. Lots of photo ops and selfies, but that's weighing thin on them, Mr. Speaker. I'd like that member to go and do some research on the items I've just spoken about, and anyone to bring to the floor of the House of Commons if I'm wrong on the shipbuilding investment in the Halifax shipyards not being the largest single infrastructure public procurement project ever in Atlantic Canadian history, Mr. Speaker. As someone that lived and served and studied in Atlantic Canada, I'm very proud of that track record. I'm now speaking on a continued debate on C-100 and the amendment offered by the NDP, and I might as well get to the crunch of the challenge we face here, Mr. Speaker. As Conservatives, we negotiated 98% of Canada's export access. 98% were deals negotiated by Conservatives. The U.S. Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the CETA Agreement, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which basically was agreed upon in the middle of the 2015 election, Mr. Speaker. Then the U.S. pulled out and there were some changes made. South Korea, a ton of bilateral agreements. There's really only 2 or 3 free trade agreements that were not negotiated by Conservative governments. One was the Israel Free Trade Agreement, which we modernized, and I think maybe Chile, Mr. Speaker. But by and large, 98% of our export access negotiated by Conservatives. So we have been frustrated in this process, seeing a lack of attention on trade, on export, on key market sectors to be put forward in the renegotiation of NAFTA. And this amendment raises a range of issues, but core to the problems with the NAFTA negotiation was actually not the outcomes on labor, because the U.S. was concerned basically about labor rates in Mexico, Mr. Speaker. There was never concern. In fact, Canada is a signatory to more ILO treaties than the U.S. is. What's interesting, Mr. Speaker, is just today, in front of Congress, the USTR, Ambassador Lighthizer, actually viewed it as a success that Mexico is going to have a secret ballot in the union elections, Mr. Speaker, something the Liberals oppose, democratic approach to elections for union representation, Mr. Speaker. They likely oppose it because Jerry Dias appears to be a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, advising on now how to spend the $600 million media fund, Mr. Speaker. That should trouble Canadians. But the problem was the focus in NAFTA negotiations. Softwood lumber, our eternal irritant with the U.S. relationship, Mr. Speaker. In fact, Canadian softwood allows home ownership in the United States to be available to more people. The only reason the tariffs on our softwood that were agreed upon by this government is not having as big of impact as it could, Mr. Speaker, is the voracious appetite in the United States right now for construction, for softwood in general. So the industry, the price is strong enough, demand is strong enough that they're kind of living with the tariff that's been imposed. You may recall, Mr. Speaker, that when the Harper government came in, they actually made the unusual decision of asking David Emerson to switch parties to help drive towards a deal on softwood. And that was the last agreement we were able to lock down with the United States. So that's been a perpetual irritant in the trade relationship with Canada, largely due to a few stakeholders in U.S. that have a lot of influence in Washington, holding back affordability for many millions of Americans. So they should have used this opportunity of opening up NAFTA to get resolution on a core irritant of trade. If we're going to modernize, let's fix something that we're always fighting with the Americans on. It wasn't even mentioned in the Liberals' priority, nor was auto. As I said earlier, the Auto Pact of 1965 was the first free trade between Canada and the U.S. We would not have NAFTA. We would not have U.S. FTA were it not for the Auto Pact. That wasn't mentioned as a priority. You have most of the ag sectors not mentioned. The minister, in fairness, did mention supply management, did not push back at any of President Trump's inflated rhetoric on 200% tariff quotas. And the U.S. spends more on agricultural subsidies than we spend on our military, Mr. Speaker. When were we pushing back at that? There is no level playing field in agriculture if they're spending billions in direct subsidies. So we ignored ag, we ignored auto, we ignored softwood. We we literally left out most of the areas that we should have been focused on right from the start. And that's what Conservatives said, that's what our leaders said, that's what I said, it's what many of our members said. We also then urged them to look at ballistic missile defense, modernizing NORAD, as a way to remind Americans that if they're going to impose tariffs because of security grounds, 232 tariffs, they don't do that with their one partner on homeland defense and security, Canada. They didn't do that. In fact, they took positions antithetical to the US. In fact, Canada pulled out our jets in the fight against ISIS when the US were asking us to do more on security. This Prime Minister, in his second vote in this Parliament, whipped by the former head of our army, I would note he's retiring, Mr. Speaker. He was the whip. I know how difficult that must have been to withdraw from a battle when our allies are trying to step up. The Obama presidency, Mr. Speaker, the bromance the Prime Minister brags about all the time, they wanted us to stay in. We were not seen as a trusted, reliable security partner under this Prime Minister. So when tariffs, 232 tariffs were being talked about on security grounds, we were not making our case. And here's something else I recommended, and I would recommend the Minister for Climate Change, who likes repeating the lines. She informed us how they try and fool Canadians by just being persistent, yelling, being loud and loud and loud, and then they'll totally believe you. The big miss that we had in modernizing NAFTA, Mr. Speaker, was modernizing trucking and transportation in North America. We knew that President Trump had issues with Mexican trucking and some of the border rules in terms of states on the border and trucking regulations. Here's what's interesting. When the Mulroney government negotiated the US Free Trade Agreement, concluded in the 1988 election, Mr. Speaker, Canada still owned Air Canada. We hadn't even liberalized passenger aircraft airline travel, Mr. Speaker. It was still a Crown corporation. Fast forward to today, 2017, 2018, 2019. We see efficiencies from more open skies. I'd like to see even more. We see efficiencies in the North American railroads, where Canadian companies like CP and CN have done very well with liberalized transportation rules. We urge this government, if you wanted to do a game changer to truly modernize NAFTA, modernize trucking. Because in many cases, Mr. Speaker, because of state or provincial rules, if we send goods from Quebec to California or from Ontario to Massachusetts, those trucking resources often have to come back empty or do not have the ability to transport interstate. What's interesting about that, Mr. Speaker, and I know my friend, the leader of the Green Party, is listening intently, had we brought cabotage and trucking into it, it would have been the single largest reduction in greenhouse gases in the history of North America, modernizing trucking. In fact, I recommended that, and when David Emerson appeared at Transport Committee, a former transportation minister, someone very well regarded in the industry as well, Mr. Speaker, I asked him that very question. Would that not have been a win on both the trade front and the environment front? He agreed, would have been the single largest way to reduce greenhouse gases. So despite the rhetoric, this government's greenhouse gas reduction plan is a tax. We could have worked this into NAFTA. And the timing was there, Mr. Speaker. As I said, liberalizing trucking regulations was not even forecast in the 80s because there was still state ownership of airlines and things like that, Mr. Speaker. Today, with air liberalized to a large degree, to rail, to short sea shipping in many cases, we could have added trucking. And not only would it reduce greenhouse gases, it would have made businesses more efficient, would have potentially reduced costs, maximize the utility of our trucking infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. That is something we recommended into the agreement, particularly with a president who likes to tell everyone that he's a business leader. That would have been a way to say, hey, we can have a win for the customer, a win for competitiveness, fewer trucks on the road, fewer emissions. Let's modernize that in NAFTA. No, we didn't mention that either. We didn't mention our core industries like auto, softwood, key ag sectors. We didn't even get modernized professional work abilities in the United States. We didn't get digital modernization. We didn't get security and certainty with respect to where data and data storage would be for privacy reasons, Mr. Speaker. We really didn't get anything in this agreement because we didn't go into the negotiations in a strategic fashion. The Liberal government underestimated what the negotiations would amount to, and they went in with the sort of posturing image of the Prime Minister, his much vaunted progressive agenda. They kind of said, we will work with Mexico too. The Prime Minister went down to Mexico to say we're going to work together, and then what did Mexico do, Mr. Speaker? 85 direct meetings with White House administration officials. 85. So by the end, the last 2 months, as the member from Fredericton should know, because the exporters in New Brunswick have been let down by him remarkably on this file, when you're not present at the negotiation of a trilateral agreement, when you're not present, when there's only 2 parties present, it is a failure of the third party. We had negotiated ourselves away from the table, Mr. Speaker. I understand why the member from Fredericton is frustrated. You know, Mr. Speaker, he might be the next first-term Liberal to announce his retirement, Mr. Speaker. I'm losing track of how many. Pierre-Front Dillard was today. We had a few others. I think, Mr. Speaker, and I'd love the Library of Parliament to research this fact, because I'm not 100% sure, but maybe the member from Fredericton can research it too. I think that a majority government has never seen more first-time MPs leave than this government.
Order. The honourable member for Fredericton will come to order. If he wishes to yell, he can do so. Order! If the honourable member for Fredericton wants to yell, he can do so somewhere else. Order. The honourable member for Durham has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If only we'd seen that passion from the member of Fredericton a few years ago, we might have been able to avoid some of the disastrous results we've had on the trade front. You know, on nights like this, I wonder if he's reflecting on that fact, Mr. Speaker. What he's going to say when he goes back to Fredericton and says to them, we are rushing through bills like C-100 and C-101 in the final hours of Parliament because we weren't able to secure good outcomes for Canada, despite the fact that we were able to join a deal that Mexico and the US had signed. As I was saying before he had his outburst, Mr. Speaker, if there's a trilateral agreement being negotiated and one of the 3 parties is no longer at the table, we should ask, how did we let that happen? As I said in my remarks on C-100, in this year is the first year that Mexico has surpassed Canada as the #1 bilateral trade partner for the first 2 months of this year, Mr. Speaker. They surpassed us negotiating the USMCA. They had a deal on 232 tariffs before Canada, despite the fact we're NORAD partners and we've had free trade with the US for years before the Mexicans, Mr. Speaker. So I think we have to work with what the government's been able to table. We have to be able to make sure that we don't have the tariffs come back on, Mr. Speaker, because steel fabricators in Fredericton, McDougall Steel in Prince Edward Island, they can't afford another year of tariffs, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I can summarize and conclude with this, Mr. Speaker. Canadians can't afford another 4 years of the Liberals.
Questions and comments. The honourable member from Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I hope this is parliamentary, Mr. Speaker, because I'd like to quote the honourable member from Fredericton, where he said the member for Durham, how did it go, talks all kinds of crap.
Oh, that is unparliamentary, and I'd ask the member from LPAC to apologize for using an unparliamentary word.
Apologize, Mr. Speaker, but I was trying to make the point, Mr. Speaker, that you know, the doom and gloom from the member for Durham and what he tries to allege as facts is not facts at all. Just let me start. We do, you know, I would give him credit in terms of the shipbuilding deal, but what he failed to mention is, you know, they like to talk about that deal. That's because the best proposal in terms of shipbuilding came from the Irving Shipyard in Atlantic Canada, and I congratulate the shipyard for putting that proposal in. But what the member for Durham failed to mention is the lowest spending in Canadian history in terms of the military in this country was under the Stephen Harper government, of which he was a member of cabinet. Now, the member also mentioned that the United States spends more on agriculture than Canada does on military. That, in fact, is true. But for farmers in this country, Mr. Speaker, for primary producers in this country that he claims to talk about from time to time, the Harper government, under the leadership of Jerry Ritz as Minister of Agriculture, cut the safety nets for farmers in this country by 50%.
Why would they do that?
What a failure, Mr. Speaker. And the member, and I'm coming to my question, Mr. Speaker, the member loves to talk about 232 tariffs. The fact of the matter is who negotiated those tariffs away? It's this Prime Minister and this Minister of Foreign Affairs. They negotiated them away. They protected Canada interests so that we can move ahead with prosperity.
Order. Again, I ask members to contain their enthusiasm. Order. Order. The hour is late. Let us try to maintain not only our good humor, but also some decorum. The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the interventions tonight from the member from Sackville, Preston Chesacook, Fredericton, and Malpeque, there must have been a really good Atlantic reception tonight in Ottawa that these members were attending before late-night debate. But I talked about McDougall Steel, Mr. Speaker, how impressed I was when I toured the facility in Borden-Carleton, and I know that the member from there is proud. He knows that they were hurting under the tariffs. That's why we're trying to work with the government. I'd refer the member from Fredericton to Tech Steel, L&A Metalworks, and Ocean Steel in St. John, which does work across the region, Mr. Speaker. They were hurting because they were getting boxed out of North America bidding opportunities. And in fact, this trade deal, we still see Buy American provisions in the United States as well. So I'd invite that member from Fredericton to meet me this year at Tech Steel. And let's talk to them about the damage that's been done with tariffs, with trade uncertainty, and with taxes. Because remember, Mr. Speaker, these Tech Steel, McDougall Steel, these are the people the Prime Minister thinks run small businesses to avoid paying taxes, Mr. Speaker. They already had, 2 years ago, their war on small business, Mr. Speaker. Canadian businesses have had enough. And October 21st, they can choose the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've had the chance to debate the member of Durham both inside this chamber and out. And I always find it regrettable when the member descends into remarks which are so partisan so as to be lacking in any kind of credibility. Indeed, I think it undermines the hard work and the negotiations which went into modernizing of the NAFTA agreement. Negotiations which involve not only members on this side of the House, but former members and alumni from his party. And I think it is a testament to the achievements and the progress which have been made in modernizing this agreement. It will both protect millions of jobs which exist today, but likely create more as a result of making advancements in the auto sector with favorable rules of origin for high wage paying jobs in our home province of Ontario in particular, in agriculture by protecting the supply management side. I know that's something that one of his leadership contenders doesn't believe in. When it comes to the environment, reducing pollution, gender, protecting women's rights, and in particular, labor, who we invited to the table to ensure that we got the best possible trade deal, that hardworking Canadians' labor rights would be protected. So now, when it's one thing to hear the member for Durham complain about all of this progress, but when you listen to the former leader of his party, Rona Ambrose, when you listen to James Moore, a former colleague of his, when you listen to a former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, former Prime Minister Kim Campbell, and now the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, speak very favorably about this deal, and when indeed this member is very likely going to vote in favor of this new NAFTA, is it not the height of hypocrisy to hear all of the criticism which are laid to bear thin? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Durham, order.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if Canadians are still watching, I want them to know that we have lots of respect and friendships across the aisle, and I'm friends with the member from Eglinton Lawrence, and I'll try to tone down my partisanship. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank him for asking his last question in the House of Commons. Mr. Speaker, what I find interesting is a lot of the members keep quoting elements of this deal that aren't in the deal, Mr. Speaker. We know they made really big news about the progressive agenda, but there is no chapter on gender. In fact, in the Chilean deal where they updated an appendix, it was non-binding provisions. So they're pointing to things that aren't even in the deal, but are still in the brand talking points of the Prime Minister. And that's the problem with their approach to trade. It's the problem with the trip to India, Mr. Speaker. It's the problem with China. It's the problem with Saudi Arabia. It's the problem with the Philippines. It's the problem with Italy, Mr. Speaker, who have imposed tariffs on durum wheat, Mr. Speaker. Right now, Canada is not seen as being serious under this Prime Minister because he puts electoral prospects in certain parts of the country. He puts his own brand and image and photographs ahead of our trade, of our economic future, ahead of our security. When France asked us after the Bataclan attack to step up our fight against ISIS, he was the only Western leader to pull back. Shameful. Countries notice, Mr. Speaker, and as the foreign affairs critic, I meet with them. And near the end of the meeting, it's clear they're wondering what has happened to Canada. We don't need more photographs or hashtags. We need more principled Canadian leadership in the world, and that's what they'll get with a Conservative government.
The honourable member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of concerns that I have about this agreement, including the import of dairy with potentially bovine growth hormone in it, the extension of patents from 8 years to 10 years, Article 22, which is about state-owned enterprises and the carve-out for the Trans Mountain expansion, and seeing now that we have this state-owned enterprise that is excluded from this deal. But I would ask the honourable member about the provisions in investor-state dispute settlement. I know he's said that we don't have enough time to debate this issue, but I know that the investor-state dispute settlements are part of the FIPA agreements that the Conservative governments had pushed through, including the Canada-China agreement, which allows Chinese state-owned corporations to sue Canada for laws and policies that get in the way of their profits, and I would like to hear what...
Order. The honourable member for Durham. I'm sorry, there's very little time. 30 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith, my first time responding to his question. I share his concern about the loss we had on data protection with respect to biologics. I've seen the impact of those drugs, personalized medicine. I think that was one of many losses, so I share his concern. ISDS is one, and his leader would know. What's interesting is they don't seem to recognize that foreign companies operating here can already use our court system, Mr. Speaker. The most fair in the world when they're not interfering with it like in the SNC-Lavalin affair. But, Mr. Speaker, we need that certainty in other countries. So with the FIPA with China, we were giving Canadian exporters the right to sue there.
Resuming debate.